It was a peaceful evening in the neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the houses. Most people were inside, winding down after a long day. Suddenly, the calm was broken. Bright red and blue flashing lights lit up the street, and the sound of sirens cut through the quiet air. Mrs. Grace stood in her front yard, her finger pointed at the house next door. She looked furious. The Adesoy family, who had just moved in, were standing outside, clearly shocked as the police questioned them. The whole neighborhood had gathered, curious and nervous. Everyone was looking at the Adesoyes with suspicion, but no one knew the real reason the police had come. Mrs. Grace, however, was certain. She had called them. She had accused the family of illegal activities, and now she was watching as they were humiliated in front of everyone. What she didn't know was that her actions were about to lead to an unexpected turn of events. Mrs. Grace was known in the neighborhood as someone who always had an opinion about everything. She spent most of her days looking out of her window, watching the world around her. She didn't mind being alone, as long as she had something to gossip about. Her house was tidy and old, just like her ways of thinking stuck in the past. She believed the world was much simpler when everyone stayed in their own lane. So, when the Adesoy family moved in next door, Mrs. Grace didn't take kindly to it. The Adesoys were different from the people she was used to. They were warm, friendly, and full of life. The children ran around laughing while the parents greeted the neighbors with open arms. But Mrs. Grace didn't see any of that. Instead, she watched from her window, her mind quickly jumping to conclusions. What are they doing here? She thought, shaking her head. She wasn't happy with the change and immediately started forming opinions. Mrs. Grace had lived in this neighborhood for years, and she wasn't ready to accept anyone who didn't fit into her idea of what the neighborhood should be. As the days passed, Mrs. Grace's suspicion of the Adesoye family grew stronger. She watched them closely, always from behind her curtains, always searching for something she could use against them. She saw the children playing in the yard and immediately thought they were causing trouble. When they had visitors, Mrs. Grace assumed the worst. Maybe they were up to something illegal. Every little noise, every movement, made her more convinced that the family didn't belong. Her mind twisted harmless actions into something sinister. One afternoon, after seeing a few strangers parked outside the house, Mrs. Grace snapped. She marched inside, grabbed the phone, and called the police, accusing the Adesoyes of illegal activities. She claimed they were hiding something, maybe drugs or even criminals. Mrs. Grace felt certain that the family was up to no good, and she wasn't about to let it go. She knew her neighbors might not believe her, but she didn't care. She was determined to make sure the police came and put a stop to whatever she thought was happening next door. A few minutes after Mrs. Grace made the call, the sound of sirens filled the air again. This time, the police cars stopped in front of the Adesoye house. Mrs. Grace stood by her window, watching eagerly as two officers stepped out of their vehicles. The officers walked up to the door, knocked, and then started speaking with Mr. and Mrs. Adesoy. The family was surprised and confused, but remained calm. They answered the officers' questions politely, trying to understand what was happening. The children, who had been playing outside, stopped in their tracks and watched from the yard. Neighbors began to gather, whispering among themselves, unsure of what to think. Mrs. Grace stood in the front yard, looking satisfied, as she watched the scene unfold. She believed she had done the right thing, and now everyone would see the truth. But Mr. Adesoy remained calm, even when the officers asked to check his home. He invited them in without hesitation, showing them everything. The situation felt tense, but there was no sign of the illegal activity Mrs. Grace had accused them of. Yet, her eyes stayed fixed on the family, convinced that something wasn't right. As the officers continued their search, something unexpected happened. One of the officers decided to do a routine background check on Mr. Adesoye. It was a standard procedure, just to make sure everything was clear. But when the results came through, they revealed a shocking truth. Mr. Adesoye wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a senior judge, known for his fairness and his work in the legal system. The officer looked at the file in disbelief, realizing who they were dealing with. They had no idea that the man they had been questioning was a respected figure in the law. The officer quickly pulled aside Mrs. Grace and the other officers, whispering the discovery. Mrs. Grace's face turned pale as she tried to process the information. She had no idea that the man she had accused of criminal activities was someone with such power and respect. The truth hit her hard. She had wrongly accused a man who was an authority in the community. Meanwhile, Mr. Adesoye stayed calm, not reacting to the new discovery. He had nothing to hide and was still polite to the officers. As the truth about Mr. Adesoye came to light, everything started to change for Mrs. Grace. The officers quietly informed her that her accusations were false, and they would be taking no further action against the Adesoye family. Mrs. Grace tried to defend herself, claiming she had only wanted to protect the neighborhood, but her words felt empty. Neighbors who had been watching the situation unfold now turned their backs on her. The friendly faces that had once waved hello now looked at her with disgust. The whispers started, people were angry, and some even felt betrayed. Mrs. Grace, who had spent so many years judging others, found herself the target of the very thing she had shown so much of: judgment. She had ruined her own reputation with her lies. The other neighbors began to show their support for the Adesoyes, apologizing for what had happened and expressing their regret for believing Mrs. Grace's false claims. Mrs. Grace was left standing alone, surrounded by the consequences of her actions. The shame of her behavior weighed heavily on her, and for the first time she realized the cost of her prejudice. The proud, confident woman who once stood in judgment of others now faced the reality of her mistakes. Despite everything that had happened, Mr. Adesoye remained calm and dignified. He never raised his voice or showed anger, even when he had every reason to do so. As he spoke to the neighbors, he shared a powerful message about justice and fairness. He explained how important it is to treat everyone with respect, no matter where they come from or what they look like. We all have the right to live without fear of being judged wrongly, he said quietly. His words made a deep impact on the people listening. They realized that, even in a moment of conflict, Mr. Adesoye had shown more strength and integrity than anyone could have expected. The family didn't need to fight back or prove their innocence. They already had the truth on their side. The lesson was clear. Dignity and respect are stronger than hate and judgment. As the neighbors nodded in agreement, they made a promise to themselves to be more understanding, to never let prejudice cloud their judgment again. The Adesoyes had not only earned the trust of the community, but they had also helped everyone see the true power of dignity in the face of adversity. As days passed, Mrs. Grace began to feel the weight of what she had done. She watched from her window as the Adesoye family continued to live their lives with kindness, unaffected by the chaos she had caused. The neighbors, who had once been wary, now greeted the Adesoyes with warmth and respect. The children played together, and the families exchanged friendly conversations. Mrs. Grace stood by her window, feeling a deep sense of isolation. She realized that, in trying to tear down someone else, she had only torn herself apart. The shame of her actions was too much to ignore. Slowly, she understood that hate and judgment had no place in her life, and that it was never too late to change. As the Adesoyes laughed and shared moments with the community, Mrs. Grace finally made a decision. She stepped outside her house and walked over to Mr. Adesoye's door. It wasn't much, but she knocked. She wanted to apologize. As she stood there, waiting for him to answer, she knew that this small step could be the beginning of something new. The lesson was clear for everyone in the neighborhood. Kindness, truth, and understanding would always win. We hope you enjoyed this story. For more related content, please subscribe our channel, and don't share to like, share, and comment.